Morning, people. We're going to start. There'll be other people straggling in. It's the mustard seat, so that's kind of what we do, I guess. Hello, is there anybody in Edmonton? I can't tell. There. Hey, Edmonton. Hey, Shelter. Everybody's talking. So everybody wave at Wendy. There you go. Okay, I get to introduce Wendy. Sorry? I'm not Wendy, no. Wendy's right there. No, they're not. They're waving at Wendy. Anyway, I get to introduce Wendy this morning, and there's one word that describes Wendy because she's the person in the world that uses this word more than anybody I've ever met, and the word is fabulous. Everything is fabulous with Wendy at all times. Is that true? Who knows her? How many times do you hear Wendy use the word fabulous? All the time. She is the founder of the Calgary Crisis Pregnancy Center. She is the vice president of something very important at Ambrose, and I forgot what it is. Advancement, but basically runs Ambrose now, and because John left, so somebody had to. She's my dear friend, and she is one of the most knowledgeable, gifted people I've ever got to hang out with, and I can't even begin to tell you just the opportunity and the blessing she's been in my life, and that I'm much better at what I do today because Wendy's a part of my life, and so we're just really pleased to have her. So give her a little round of applause, and we're going to let her loose.
Good. I'm going to use this mic. Except for when it comes to technology. Are you hearing me now? Okay, fabulous. Good stuff. Let's begin this conversation with a story from my life at the Pregnancy Care Center. One of the things, I was there for a really long time. I started in 1985, and something significant happened in 1985. Anybody know what it was? Affected the whole world. Back to the Future came out. More important than Back to the Future. 1985, we started hearing reports out of San Francisco about the gay cancer, which later, within the year, came to be known as what? AIDS, HIV, right? And something happened within culture that impacted my work at the Pregnancy Care Center, and that was we started to talk about sex differently. And through different periods of history and time, big major events shape us and form our generation. And our generations are formed, and our generational perspectives are formed largely by the stuff that happens in our early years. Kind of what happens in the first 18 years of your life will shape how you interact with the world. Does that make sense to you? I can tell you that I'm a baby boomer, and we didn't talk about sex. If you were very lucky, your mother might have given you some information, but lots of my friends got Zippo in that regard. And now today, who doesn't talk about sex? And where don't we talk about sex? Do you get that 1985 HIV/AIDS was the thing that changed our dialogue, right? Because suddenly sex became a life and death issue, and so the conversation changed, and the culture changed with it. So just a little generational perspective for you. One of the things that I used to do in the Pregnancy Care Center was go into high schools and do sex education. And, I think it's really awful to bore people, and so I like to play games. Sadly, today we won't get to play too many games with you guys. But, particularly when I'm with teenagers, we should have some fun while we learn stuff. And so I used to play a game with them, and I wouldn't tell them the name of the game, but I'd hand everybody out a piece of paper, and almost everybody would get a blank piece of paper, but 7 people in the class would get one of the 7 most commonly transmitted sexually transmitted infections, STIs. And it was a great object lesson in teaching because I would have them trade papers, and they had to trade papers 3 times, which illustrated having 3 partners, and we'd see what percentage of the class became infected with an STI, and then we would talk about all the STIs, right? And, it was great fun, everybody laughed, but as we actually talked about the diseases, it had a significant impact on them, right? And they had been processing the information differently. And so as a speaker, you want people to remember what you've been trying to teach them. That's sort of the whole point of it. Every once in a while, though, you wish they didn't remember quite so well. I went to church one Sunday morning, and I was going out to Earl's with a group of friends after church for lunch. And one of the staff spots me and comes running across the restaurant and goes, "Hi, Wendy, do you remember me?" And I'm looking at her blankly, as speakers often do, because we meet lots of people, and you don't always remember where you know them from. And so I've got that blank look on my face. And so she's a teenage girl, right? She's going to help me remember. So guess how she helped me remember? "Oh, Wendy, you must remember me. You gave me genital herpes." The whole restaurant is looking at me, and I am like, I have no idea what to say. Anything I say is just going to get me in trouble at this point in time. So what's the difference between my generation and this young girl's generation? She grew up feeling very free to talk about this stuff. I can guarantee you that I probably got through high school without ever saying the word genital out loud. Right? That's just the difference in generations. And one of the things that we need to be working at is to have an appreciation for each other. Too often, we have a tendency to stereotype each other in our generations. And so baby boomers, you're largely referred to as micromanaging, workaholic control freaks. That's the typical description of a baby boomer. Gen X, typical description for you? Job hopping slackers with entitlement issues. Any of you heard that one? And then the millennial generation, the one that's emerging for them is, believe it or not, deluded narcissists. And here's the scary part. On the narcissism scale, for Gen X and baby boomers, 1 out of 8 scores as a narcissist. Yeah, on the scale, right? Like there's extremes. There's the really pathological narcissist and just managing to get on the scale. So get on the scale, baby boomers and Gen X, 1 out of 8 get on the scale for narcissism. Millennials, want to take a guess? 1 out of 3 get on the narcissist scale. Not necessarily at high levels, but on the scale. So interesting things that emerge about generations, and we're going to try and explore some of, not just the what are generations, but we're going to try and explore the why. I want to read a quote to you. The children now love luxury. The children now love luxury. They have bad manners, contempt for authority. They show disrespect for adults and love to talk rather than to work or exercise. They no longer rise when adults enter the room. They contradict their parents and chatter in front of company, gobble down their food at the table, and intimidate their teachers. Sound like any young people you know? All of them. Well, that was Socrates, who lived between 469 and 399 BC. Okay? Every generation looks at the generation coming after them and goes, "We are in such trouble. When are these people going to get it?" I started doing this generational talk and doing it in the corporate sector here in Calgary because I had a donor at the Pregnancy Care Center. He wrote me lots of large checks, and we'd go out for lunch periodically, and we just talk about life. He ran a company where he hired lots of engineers. And he was a baby boomer, and frankly, he was frustrated by his Gen X engineers because they did not approach work like he did. And he's like, when are they going to get it? And I said, well, they're not going to get it because they're different than you are. And I went on to explain to him why they had a different perspective on how work should happen and where work should sit in the constellation of your life. And he was like, well, Wendy, that's fabulous. That's probably my interpretation now that I think about it. But it's like, I've got a lunch happening at the Chamber of Commerce next week, and I want you to be the keynote speaker, and I want you to talk on this topic. And off I went to spend huge amounts of time talking about this issue in the corporate sector here in Calgary. And it resonates with people because we do get, at some level, I see the world very differently than you do. And one of the things that I hope that you get out of our time together today is this, that, let me try advancing, try it that way, maybe, there we go. Strong teams are dependent upon individuals understanding and appreciating each other's differences. So I want to do a little bit of a breakdown here. Who was born after 19 or before 1964? Stick up your hand. I know you're not supposed to ask age. Okay, so we've got some baby boomers in the room. Who was born between 1964 and 1980? Okay, my Gen Xers are accounted for, and my millennial generation, or Generation Y, you're born between 1980, after 1980, very good. You won't have any Gen Z yet on staff, unless you're into child labor, which I hope you're not. That's a whole nother talk we could do. Okay, so have you noticed this difference? That there's a bit of a conflict sometimes. Organizations reflect this conflict all the time. And it can be an incredible strength for us, or it can be a weakness. But I want you to leave today going, okay, I get why John sees the world this way. And I can help John by sharing a generational perspective with him, right? Or I can challenge John to say, you're not seeing it the way most of my generation sees it, and I think it impacts people this way. Does this make sense? That we should be able to have these conversations with each other and talk about why perspectives matter. So let's move on, and we'll come back to the scripture part a little bit later. Generational conflict is really important in the workplace right now, and we're talking about it a lot because whenever culture moves quickly, generational conflict increases. Probably we've never lived in a time when the world is moving faster than it has in the last 100 years. Would you agree with this? I mean, if we go back historically, we could go hundreds of years without having any real generational conflict because people's lives were so the same. You know, if you go back to that agrarian age, right before technology or industry, you know, you were born on the farm, you died on the farm, you planted the field, summer, spring, winter. You know, there weren't huge, necessarily cataclysmic events shaping your generational perspective. So generational conflict didn't happen much. Now we're moving at a pace that's inconceivable. Like, try and think about people who lived in a world where encyclopedias mattered. Bill and John and I remember this. My parents were committed to my education, and so they bought encyclopedias. I wrote reports using the encyclopedias. My parents retired from the farm, and my mother was cleaning out stuff. Those encyclopedias represented a big investment for my parents, right? Like, they spent what for them was a lot of money. And my mother was desperate that one of us would take these encyclopedias. Do you think any of her 4 daughters wanted the encyclopedias when they moved? Like, I mean, it was beyond ridiculous, right? But it was, you get that kind of thing going on. So we want to talk about conflict in the workplace. One of the things that we're dealing with today, there are 4 impacts or influences on generational conflict. The first one is the information explosion. Okay? Is there a lot of information available to you today? Absolutely. Like, I mean, teaching has changed today. One of the things that's going on in the average classroom is somebody makes a statement and you're fact-checking your professor. Do you think they're intimidated? Right? You're on Google going, that doesn't sound quite right to me. And instead of coming back to the prof and challenging him, right? Like, the prof is being challenged in the moment. And so conversations in classrooms are changing. We wait for no information at all. This is a little hard for some of us who are a bit older to understand. You know, you're sitting at brunch and you're going, oh, yeah, he's in that movie. What's his name? I can't remember. Now, us baby boomers would live in suspended animation. It would come to us 5 hours later when we're driving down the street. But, you know, it's like, we'll get it eventually. You guys, what do you do? You're sitting at the same, well, I will pull out my phone and I will figure out that it's Bradley Cooper. Who starred in that movie? We're all talking about and thinking about it. We can't come up with the name. And so instant information and access to huge amounts of information, it's actually changed some of the dynamic in the workplace. 2010 was an incredibly significant year because Stanford University managed to digitize their entire library. What that meant is that as of 2010, virtually everything that's knowable by man is available at a click of your mouse. Who do you suppose is best at accessing information? Most skilled? What generation do you think would have the edge? The youngest, millennials. The internet has always existed for you millennials, and so finding information is just a part of your DNA. It's not quite the same for those of us who live in this world. I am still, having to stop myself and remind myself, oh, I can figure out how to fix the fact that there is water pooling in my vegetable cooler and freezing, right? It's like I can go online and find the answer to that and actually attempt to repair versus paying $150 for somebody to come out and do that. And it's like, what question can't you Google? Have you found a question that Google didn't have some information for you that was at least partly useful? Right? I mean, we can find anything. So information explosion. Then we have the next influence, which is the technology revolution. Okay? Baby boomers, stick up your hand. I have news for you. You might have been born in Canada, but guess what? Len Sweet, who's a theologian, does sociology stuff as well, says that we can divide the world into two categories, immigrants and natives. If you're born prior to 1964, you are an immigrant to technology. It doesn't come naturally to you. Technology is like a second language for us. We can become proficient in it, but we don't do it intuitively. So I'll tell you an old story. At the Pregnancy Care Center, lots of volunteers. When you work in a volunteer organization, have you noticed that stuff just lands in interesting places? Like, it's a big part of a volunteer organization is that lots of stuff gets misplaced on a regular basis. This was quite some years ago, but recognize that we had technology on every desk. Everybody had a computer. And I was looking for a phone book because I needed to make a phone call. And there wasn't a phone book in the place that it should have been, so I'm sort of running around the center looking a bit harassed. And there's a young practicum student sitting at the reception desk, and she goes, so, Wendy, what are you looking for? And I'm like, oh, practicum students, they ask questions about everything, right? I'm like, I'm looking for a phone book. And my inner dialogue, which isn't always as nice as what comes out, was, and it'd be so nice if you get off your duff and help me find it. And she said, so whose number are you looking for? And I'm like, seriously? So I tell her, and I'm off to the next room. And 30 seconds later, the practicum student is handing me a piece of paper with a number on it. She goes, here you go. And I went, how'd you do that? And she looked at me like I was a lunatic and went, I cannot believe what it must be like to be you, so handicapped in the modern work world. She went 411.ca. And it's like, oh, I knew that. I had a computer on my desk. I could have done that. But it's just like, I had, 30 plus years of looking in a phone book. That's just, it's kind of hard to break some of those habits, right? Do you get that? Okay. This whole technology thing, right? I took up running a couple of years ago, and, I was chatting with a couple of the younger staff I had at the center, and was talking about, I'm having trouble, figuring out how far I'm running and that sort of, and they look at me and go, do you have an iPhone? I go, yeah. And they go, well, there's an app for that, Wendy. Runkeeper's free. And it's like, oh, right? You guys have an app for everything. Would you agree? Right? And I've learned to use apps, right? I love them. That Open Table and Urban Spoon, what is it? It's been replaced by something. There's a new name for Urban Spoon. Anyways, I travel lots. It's like I've found lots of fun restaurants because I've learned the wonderful art of apps, right? You guys design apps. You see a hole, you design an app, right? My generation just looks for an app that's already made. And away we go. So technology is dividing us. We can all learn to do technology, but again, that younger generation, it's intuitive. Okay, a worldview shift from modern to postmodern. Worldview shifts do not happen frequently. Baby boomers represent the last generation of a worldview. And so now I'm going to apologize to every history and philosophy professor I ever studied under, because in 5 minutes, we're going to study a whole bunch of things and how this actually works. So, oops, we'll come back to that one. 3 worldviews. Pre-Enlightenment was pre the 1600s. Okay? If you're trying to get a sense of when this was, it was just before the time of Shakespeare and Henry VIII. It was, and I believe, therefore I am. Faith actually controlled the Western world and influenced how we approached life. Everything was seen through that narrative of a Christian Judeo world view. And The mantra was, I know I exist because I believe God has created me. And that was the worldview that everybody carried pretty much across the board, was that Christian belief. Then we moved on to Enlightenment, 1600 to 1964. And Enlightenment is also sometimes referred to as modernism. Okay? And this particular generation, baby boomers are the last generation of modernists. Okay? Gen X are postmodern, as are millennials. So, let's take a look at what Enlightenment did to us. Enlightenment saw an explosion of knowledge. And it was another one of those information knowledge explosion experiences, and it happened because we were going through the third rewiring of the human brain. There have been 3 rewirings of the human brain in history. The first one happened when the Greeks created an alphabet and numeric system, and suddenly we could hold on to knowledge, right? And we could pass it on, okay? And that was a truly significant event in history. Modernism was brought in by the second rewiring of the human brain. Think about a significant event that would have happened around the 1600s that changed everything. I'll give you another hint. A&E named it as the most significant event of the last millennium. Anybody know what it was? The printing press. Absolutely. The printing press changed everything. Because suddenly we had this shift in the world. You know, sometimes people go to Europe and they travel around and they look at all the empty cathedrals and go, isn't this sad, stained glass, and they've missed it. And it's like, I go to Europe and go, wow, how amazing that they took hundreds of years to build these incredible buildings to honor God, and that in a non-literate society, they tried to tell the story of Scripture through stained glass. I have a favorite place I go every time I get to Paris. I go to, they do lovely little classical music concerts. But I love this particular chapel. It's tiny, but if you start on the left-hand side, it starts in Genesis, and it works its way around this kind of circular-shaped chapel to Revelations. And it was built by a king who wanted to, commemorate an anniversary on the throne. But it really is this beautiful picture of a non-literate world trying to hold on to the truth and power of the gospel. So I walk into empty cathedrals and see a testament to the power of the gospel in hundreds of years trying to capture it for people. And we do it differently today. So, Enlightenment, the printing press. Suddenly, the thing that communicated extreme wealth prior to the Enlightenment was you owned books, right? What's extreme wealth demonstrated by today? Clothing, cars, we kind of wear and show off our wealth. Prior to the Enlightenment, books were the ultimate status symbol, that you were literate and that you owned a book. Because they all had to be handwritten, right? And our fathers of the faith did that for us, devoted their whole life to doing letter-by-letter translation of the gospel. So, Enlightenment, printing press. Do you know that Enlightenment and the printing press was the start of the Reformation? Somebody has suggested that Henry VIII, in his desire to divorce wives and go against the church, was the first blogger in the world, because he used to, with the printing press, put it to work for himself, getting the propaganda out to the people. And he wrote pamphlets, right? The predecessor or the preceder of the modern day blog. This is why I should be able to divorce my wives. This is why we're going to have not absolute authority sitting in Rome, and we had the Protestant Reformation begin in that context. Okay? So, explosion of knowledge and modernism, and an explosion of the importance of science. I think, therefore I am was a French philosopher named Descartes. Descartes was doing something that only a modernist would do. He was angsting one day about whether or not he existed. Like, how can I know if I exist? And if I can't prove my existence, then it isn't real. Do you see why faith fell into kind of disrepute during modernism and began to lose its influence? It was all about science's explosion with that advent of knowledge being available and in a printed format. We suddenly valued things that could be empirically proven. Can you empirically prove the existence of God? Beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Yes.
Well, there are different opinions on it, but most of us would say no. But there's great evidence in support of, but you can't prove it 100%. That's the concept of, right? So we have in this context, right, the part sitting there going, well, I don't even know if I exist, and I'm very puzzled by this. And then he begins to sort of, as Oprah would say, have a light bulb moment, and he went, hold it. I'm wondering if I exist. My wondering whether or not I exist actually proves that I do exist. And now I can move on to worry about other big questions in life. I think, therefore, I am. Okay? Adding the world up very logically is sort of a modernist tendency. Postmoderns, 1964 to present. This is the third rewiring of the human brain. And it's interesting that technology played a part in the third rewiring of the human brain. And it also moved us from this absolute empirical to there are many things that can't be proved empirically that matter and are important. The third rewiring of the human brain was brought about by what? The internet. The information superhighway. Any of you ever heard of that one? Seriously, I'm like old as dirt. I remember being in college, and my friend's dad came from Toronto. He's a very successful businessman, and he took a bunch of us out for lunch, and he was telling us about this information superhighway, and and it was. I'm listening to him thinking, this is the it was incomprehensible. Like he's described, it's like incomprehensible to me. How could we possibly access all of the information? He's trying to explain this guy. Might as well have been talking science fiction, right? For all that it had meaning. What's the reality today? Millennials, stick up your hands again. You've always lived in a world where the internet existed, right? You can't comprehend a world without it. It's done a rewiring of the human brain. But it's this, I feel, therefore I am. Okay? Now, this does not mean that millennials are not graduating great people who can still apply the laws of physics and build bridges that are safe to drive over. But the fundamental shift is in how you make decisions. This whole topic of study became interesting to me because I'm a baby boomer. When I started working at the Pregnancy Care Center, I was counseling women who were the same age as I was. And I could do this exercise with them on pros and cons of abortion, and we would write the pros down and we would write the cons down, and I could predict what a woman would choose by the time she'd finished putting together her pros and cons list, right? It was a very logical, thoughtful process. And then suddenly I noticed that my younger clients would go through the same exercise. I could use the same exercise with them, going through pros and cons. And the choice, to me, the baby boomer, that they were going to make would be obvious. Like, the list would indicate where we're going. And they go, thank you, this has been so helpful. I'm going to do this. And it's like, hold it, your decision does not line up with what we just did on the pros and cons list. This is making no... And when I probed deeper, it always got down to, I feel. And the decision came out of feeling. Does that make sense to you? It was radical for me to sort of wrap my head around, I have to come at how I do this type of counseling very differently with a different generation. Because the conversation has changed and the value of stuff has changed. So, 3 rewirings of the human brain. Alphabet numeric system, then the printing press, then the internet. Gen Y, millennials being the first generation of the fully rewired human brain. And guess what? We're even going to talk a little bit about Gen Z today because we're beginning to notice some things about them even though they're not yet in the workforce. So, 4 generations in the workplace today is 2. Average life expectancy at the turn of the century was, anybody want to take a guess? 57. I'm almost living on borrowed time, if it were the turn of the century, right? It's kind of like, I'm done in 3 years? I don't think so. I'm planning, those of us who work in the nonprofit system are in the Freedom 85 plan, right? figure I've got a good 25, 30 years of work ahead of me before I'm going to get to cash it in. Do you get that we have an interesting dynamic going on with 4 generations in work today? People who are in pastoral ministry are having a hugely challenging time because they've got 5 generations in the church. And if there's one thing church does well, it's tradition, both in the positive and the negative, right? And, you know, I mean, we've seen the church split on the craziest of issues, right? Like, you know, there's a fight brewing in a church I know right now about whether or not it's actually spiritual to have ATMs in the lobby to help with people's giving, right? Like that's just sacrilege in the mind of many people, right? And so why is one piece of technology okay in church and another not, right? And these are interesting times that we live in. And so we've got people working together. I'm going to tell you at Mustard Seed, my suspicion is you have probably got one of the largest age spans by the time you start factoring in, what's your oldest volunteer? Anybody know? Do you have a volunteer over the age of 80 here? Absolutely, right? And it's like, and you have young people who come in from time to time who are in their teens, I would suspect, who come in to volunteer with you, right? Lots of generational spectrum that you guys are dealing with. So we will move on to talk about traditionalists. Okay, traditionalists. These are the people born 1922 to 1942 or 46. And I would like you to think about them for a minute. And the 42, 46, and you'll see some variation on the numbers there. Don't let that bug you. Different sociologists cut off generations at different times. It's just they sort of pick events and decide where to cut it off. So 1922 to 1942, what was happening when these people were young? What would have shaped them? War? What else? Depression. Very good. So let me tell you about these folks. They were shaped by the war and depression. You need to know that for traditionalists, until the 1930s, in North America, only 10% of the population got a high school education. Okay? In the 1930s, there was no work, so people started to stay in school because there was no point leaving. Right? They couldn't earn anything or contribute to family finances in any way. And so they started to do more education. I will tell you it's one of the generational hangovers that we've got in relationship to our church experience. You know, it used to be that the pastor was the most educated person in the congregation because typically he would finish high school, but if he didn't finish high school, he'd go off for at least a couple of years of Bible school training, and that made him the most educated person in the congregation. What's the reality today? If your pastor has a bachelor's degree, probably 30% of the congregation is more educated than the pastor. Does that, you know? And so pastor is absolute fount of all knowledge is an old paradigm, and yet some people want that level of authority and has disappeared in cultural norming. So, depression, Second World War. The needs of the individual for the betterment of who? Getting through the depression was about families helping each other survive. They went off to war. And when we compare traditionalists going off to war with people going off to war today, do you get that there's a significant difference? They went. They knew they were going to be gone, not for a one-year assignment as military duty has today. They were going off to war with no idea when they'd come back or if they'd come back. Most of them spent 5 years and had only paper communication with home. No Skyping, no telephone calls. Tremendous ability to put aside their needs for the benefit of somebody else. They lived like that their whole lives. Do you get that? Because they were raised in the Depression, what did they do? Saved every cent. My mother saves 1 tablespoon of corn if it's left in the dish. We tease her because it just goes into the fridge and turns into something furry and friendly. But she can't throw stuff away, right, because of how she was raised. What's the reality of that for us today? This generation that's now dying is leaving trillions of dollars behind because they were so frugal. Okay? From a charities perspective, most of us have planned giving programs to capitalize on the strength of this generation, which was they were savers. 50% of the men of this generation did military service. How do you think that affected their leadership? Top down. The person at the top of the organization knows it all and tells you what to do. And you really shouldn't question anything. What else do we know about these folks? They were loyal. Loyal to things like the military, loyal to institutions like the church. If they start, from a fundraising perspective, if they started supporting something, they would continue to support it for the rest of their lives. Baby boomers, how long do you think we support things for? We've got about a 7-year cycle. And Gen Y, how long do you support something? Until the next viral video phase comes on, right? And we're not dumping ice buckets on each other's heads, but it's, it's certainly different. Okay. There. We're in 1946 to 1961. What defined us? Our name tells us something that traditionalists were also very good at. They were good at having babies. They came back for more, and they had a record number of babies. It's said that every baby boomer has the same middle name, and that middle name is competition. Okay? We were always competing because there was this huge mass of us entering the world, right? We were big bubbles in the class, big bubbles as we went into university. You had to compete to get into university. It wasn't a given. Traditionalists wanted their children to get an education. Baby boomers were the first generation where almost everybody finished high school. From a perspective, many went on to get a degree. In fact, baby boomers were told, go to school, get a degree, and you will be set for life. Yes? Oh, absolutely. I'm sorry. Oh, this will work better if I take this off. Okay. I am so sorry. There we go. All right. So, tell me other things that shaped baby boomers. What were the influences? Besides the fact that they were competing because there was this big bubble of them. What went on when baby boomers were young? What? Television. Bill's heard this before. The single biggest impactor of baby boomers was television. Okay? But I want you to think about some of the other things that went on for baby boomers. First generation to be able to think about self-fulfillment. If you go into a bookstore and look at the self-help section, it will be almost entirely baby boomer authors. Okay? Self-fulfillment was a luxury of the wealthy in previous generations. Became a part of the DNA of baby boomers. And they were the generation that was called the me generation, right? What do I want out of life? So they're divorced at higher rates than previous generations because if I'm not happy in my marriage, I have a right to be self-fulfilled, and so I will leave, right? The reality for a traditionalist was if you left your marriage, in all probability you were plunging your family into abject poverty and yourself. So they stayed. Other things that shaped baby boomers were what? Think about some movements. Cold War. Yes, baby boomers were oddly shaped on some things. If you're old enough, I'm not quite this old, but I'll bet you John experienced this. Oops, I just outed him. Did you have a drill where you hid under the desk for nuclear fallout? Not so much in Canada, but in the States, they used to seriously do drills about what happens if they drop the atomic bomb and they had the kids get under their desks. Like, does that not just make you want to laugh? It's like, yes, that's going to protect you from radiation. So we had the Cold War going on. Other influences, civil rights movement and women's rights. Absolutely, we were burning bras in the 60s, right? And saying, we can. What? Unions. Yes. Yep, people started taking vacations, okay? Radical shift in culture. We had also, in the 60s and 70s, a very large middle class. And that has eroded over time. If there's one word that describes baby boomers, it is optimistic. And why wouldn't they be optimistic? When I was a little girl, I was outside playing one day and my parents said, Wendy, you have to come in and watch TV. Odd thing for a parent to insist upon you doing, right? Like, aren't most parents trying to get their kids away from the TV? I sat down in front of the TV. I was bored out of my gourd. It was black and white TV. What I was watching was extremely fuzzy. I didn't get it. What do you suppose my parents had me in watching? The moon landing, absolutely. What do you suppose happened that day when I went out at night and I looked up and I saw the moon and I went, there are people walking around on that moon, right? How does that shape you, right? Anything's possible. That really is, like, and that was how we're shaped. Anything is possible. Let's move on and talk about, how are we doing on time? Great. Gen Xers, born 1961 to 1980. 1961, very momentous thing happened. Anybody want to know what it was? Or want to take a guess at what it was? Kennedy? Right time, not the event I'm thinking about. 1961 was the advent of the birth control pill. Okay? And it really did lay the groundwork for the sexual revolution. Okay? 1961, for the first time ever, people had the ability to manage the size of their families. We laugh in my family because I was born in 61 and my sister was born in 62. Clearly my mother didn't get the memo. And we give Darla a hard time. Do you know something? I'm sort of on that edge of being a baby boomer, Gen Xer, and so we're called cuspers. And those of you who sit on the dividing line, we're actually spend a lot of our time interpreting generations for each other. Because I kind of get it from the baby boomer perspective. I also kind of get it from the Gen X perspective. And so I've been great at mediating perspectives on this. So let's talk about the world that Gen Xers inherited. Because interesting things about Gen X is that they were shaped oftentimes by things that happened to their baby boomer parents. Okay? Unionized jobs. The economy was growing. It was just a fabulous time. And then in the early 80s, we had a huge recession. And you know what? Baby boomers were losing their jobs and were losing their homes. And here's what we discovered. Optimistic baby boomers got over that 1980s critical recession way faster, bounced back because they were optimistic than their children did. Children were severely impacted by that 80s recession. What's the number one thing that couples fight about? Money. Okay? When you go through a recession, marriage and family therapists are very busy because people are fighting about money. But for that Gen X person, mom and dad's marriage fell apart as a result of that pink slip that mom and dad came home with one day. People lost their homes. In the 80s, it was not unusual. I have a friend who actually bought her lawyer boss's home. If you're a lawyer and you declare bankruptcy, i.e. walk away from a mortgage, you can't practice law. And he was desperate. She was his secretary, and her husband had a very solid middle-class job. He literally handed the keys to his house to them and just said, you take over the mortgage and it's yours. All the equity he had built up in it, gone, right? So lost the family home. You guys are the first generation to go, you cannot trust your boss to take care of you. The pink slip will come. And you see it almost as an inevitability, and you approach work differently because of it. Tell me some other stuff that happened for Gen X that shaped them. How about this? Faith. Anything interesting happen for this generation on the faith front? How about Jonestown? A seemingly normal group of churchgoers moved out into the jungle, and one day it seemed to make sense for everybody to take cyanide, to poison themselves and their children. Can you trust an institution like the church? Highly skeptical. Questioning. Of course you would be. How about Rodney King and the LA riots? You were children when that happened. Do you get how media changes things? That TV ability to see the world? TV, when I was young, the Vietnam War was going on. But do you know how that worked? They would shoot something. It was quite sanitized by the time it got edited and was being shown 2 to 3 days later, because that's how long it took to get a piece of video footage over, to Gen X, who watched the Persian Gulf War. I was actually away at school doing an intensive course, and master's degree program, and we'd go back to the residence area. We'd all cook supper together, and we'd sit and watch the Persian Gulf War, right? And all we were watching was kind of Scud missiles shoot across the sky and land, explosion. That was Gen X's experience of watching war in their formative year. Gen Y watched what? Embedded soldiers, journalists in tanks, seeing frontline fighting. Get that discrepancy of how things change. So Gen Xers, you watched the Rodney King riots, only you got to see the police behaving badly. Here's the reality. For the most part, we have great policing in North America. The average law enforcement person that you meet is great and is there because they care about the community, right? But for Gen X, you're the first generation to have seen that not every police officer is good, and that sometimes they're evil. And what happened to Rodney King was nothing short of collective groupthink evil, as that poor guy got beaten practically to death. Led to those riots, right? You don't necessarily trust institutions to get it right, okay? So the word that most describes Gen X is skepticism. Some people see that as a negative. I actually think that when you're on a team, you want skeptics. Why do you want skeptics in your group? People who will tell you why it doesn't work. Baby boomers need skeptics in our lives because we can see the possibility so clearly. We need people to come along and temper us, and it's actually helpful. High divorce rate. Did that impact you? Gen Xers, stick up your hand again. We describe you as the loneliest generation. You spent more time alone than any generation before you and any generation since. Did you know that? This whole, we call it the latchkey kid syndrome. And when we say alone, we really mean alone. If I walk into any office in downtown Calgary between 3 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon and my colleague is on the phone, what are they likely to be doing? Parenting. They're talking to their kids. I want you to think about Gen Xers whose mom and dad divorced because of the layoff, and then they were going home from the time they were 7, 8, 9 years old by themselves, letting themselves in. And guess what happened if they called the office? Mom and dad would go, "Why are you calling me? You're going to get me in trouble with my boss because you didn't do your personal life at work at all." There was a firm boundary, right? It's like, you know, your parent was more likely to say, "Is anybody bleeding, dying? Do you need an ambulance? I'll talk to you when I get home. Don't bug me," right? What's happening now? "So, how was school today? What homework do you have? Would you get this out of the fridge for dinner?" Like, you know, long conversations, and nobody bats an eye at them because we think that should be happening. You guys have no false hope that the world is going to save you. And in fact, you've been pretty deeply disappointed because guess what Gen X discovered? Baby boomers went, "Go to school, get an education, you will be set for life." Gen X, what happened? You went to school, got an education, not necessarily set for life. Can I tell you how many Gen X Bachelor of Education people I know who have never taught a day in their life? The demographic thing, right? Got this education degree, I was supposed to be set, and now I have to figure out what to do with an education degree. Here's what's fabulous about Gen X, that skepticism. Okay, didn't work out, got to move on. Plan B, did not work. How about debt? I graduated with $3,000 of debt for my post-secondary education. Gen X graduated with what? Typically about $20,000 to $30,000. A very nice down payment for a house. Do you get some of these differences? Gen X have figured out how to make it work, but they don't trust that everything will work out. And because of that, they approach work differently. It's not all about the job. Gen X came in, and this is where this huge conflict lies, largely between baby boomers and Gen X, because it's a worldview shift about the place of work in our lives. Baby boomers were competing, so no amount of time at work is too much time for us, because I need to impress the boss. I remember having a boss tell me, "Wendy, if the job is 8 to 4:30, that means you should really try to be here for 7:30 and be at your desk working at 7:45 if you want anybody here to think that you're serious about your job. And at 4:30, you're never in the parking lot driving away. At 4:30, you might begin to think about packing up in a few minutes. But at the very least, never be looking like you're leaving the office before 4:45. What's the reality today? I am not living here, right? Gen X came along and said, no, I'm not playing this, because they'll hand me a pink slip whenever it's convenient to them. I'm going to put different boundaries on my work experience. Gen Y, we have lots of names for these people. We call them millennials because you come of age in the new millennium. Some people, I think that Len Sweet was the person who coined this one, screenagers. You've always had a screen in front of your face. Okay? You don't know a world where screens weren't a part of your upbringing. I have a friend who was a prof at the U of C, English professor, and guess what she calls you? Snowflakes. I said, snowflakes? Why snowflakes? She goes, oh, Wendy, it's because they're all special and unique. She wasn't saying it with a great deal of love. She actually is one of the few people I know who loves the privacy legislation. She goes, best thing that ever happened. I said, why? She goes, because when Johnny's mother calls to discuss with me why Johnny didn't get an A and only got a C on his English paper, I can say I cannot discuss this with you because of privacy legislation. Gen Y, you were raised by what we call helicopter parents. Parents who were hovering around making sure that life worked for you. Okay? You know what? If I had a bad teacher when I was in elementary school, my parents looked at me and said, well, suck it up and figure out how to make it work, Wendy, because you're going to have bosses that don't like you and, cope, right? I am not for a moment advocating that we should leave kids in abusive situations, but it was a life skill I learned, right? I was like, okay, you're who you are, and it served me well in some of my early jobs where I had difficult bosses. It was like, okay, I got to figure out what motivates this one, and I will manage you. You can choose to manage your bosses, you know that, right? It's called leading up is the term. So think about this. Parents hovering. We say you know your Gen Y if when you competed in a sports event, you always came home with a ribbon or a trophy. This is incomprehensible for us baby boomers, because unless you actually won, came in first, second, or third, you went home with nice you showed up. But no awards. Does that make sense? We gave you choice very, very early on. Because you know what? One of the things baby boomers hated was that axiom of children should be seen and not heard. We wanted to be heard. There was a big mass of us. We weren't heard all that much. And so when we started parenting, what did we do? We started asking your opinion before you could even form sentences. And you had them. 2-year-olds love to tell you what they think. In one word, knows, and controlling the world, right? Like, it's just, and so you had this huge voice. You had choices and options, and you took full advantage of it. Tell me some of the things that you think were shaping you as you were growing up. You're an instant generation. Mother knew that she should not be putting your bottle of formula in the microwave, but really, was she going to boil a pot of water and listen to you screech for 10 minutes? Or was she going to get the job done? Shake the bottle a little bit and hope that she, why wait? Okay? Everything was instant. We're talking about those of us who are as old as dirt. I remember those first computers. It's like you'd ask it to perform a function for you. You would hit the key, you would get up, you would go and make the coffee, you would pour the coffee, you would stand by the coffee pot and talk with people, because asking your computer to do a function could be a 10-minute exercise. What's the longest you wait for anything on your computer today, right? We're all like, I've had to wait 10 seconds. This is ridiculous. Somebody needs to come fix my computer. I can't bear this wait. So instant shaped you. Things that shaped you were things like Columbine, 9/11. You were little people when 9/11 happened. You go to work one day, and your building can fall down. Millennials worry more about workplace safety than any other generation. And yet, You know, I do this in the corporate sector, and some of them have as their greatest risk a paper cut, right? Like, you know, they're not in particularly risky jobs. It is time for us to flip. I'm just going to finish this one, and then we'll flip over to what we're doing. So, Oklahoma bombing, Enron, right? Crooked businessmen fudging the books and destroying the economy. Some people suggest that Gen Y, millennials, will be the next great generation. That you have loyalty, although you choose your loyalties. Where your traditionalist grandparents chose church, military, those sort of things to be loyal to, you guys have tremendous capacity for loyalty. You do have the optimism of your baby boomer parents, and you kind of freak out your bosses just a little bit, because most Gen Y millennials see their baby boomer boss as an extension of their parents. You're the first generation who actually liked your parents through your whole childhood. Most of us went through a period of really not liking our parents much in our late teens and early 20s, and thinking they were kind of dumb. You have quite appreciated your parents. You're as skeptical as your Gen X older siblings. And some people would say that what you have going for you is a realism that comes out of an ability to access the level of information that you have. And so we're going to come back and talk about how this works out in workplace dynamics. And I think I give it to you, and you have some announcements, Steve, before I do the devotional.
Hopefully we'll have a few more people join us in the next couple of minutes. I kind of feel like that kid that came late to the party and they got the time mixed up. But it's good to be here. A few announcements for everyone. Baseball game's on today at 2 o'clock. So we are actually going to have the game on here for anybody who wants to come over and watch the game, and we're going to open it up to our guests if they want to come in and watch it as well. It's also, I think, we're going to have it in Edmonton, at least in the conference room. I don't know if they're going to set it up in the church, but it's going to be in the conference room. And also it's going to be on at the Burning Bush too, if anybody has to work and you know needs a little bit more quiet. So you can always bring your laptop over and pretend you're working on something. So it's a really big game. So we thought, well, this would be appropriate if we watched it together. So that's happening today. Tomorrow is Got Ginch, and this is the 7th year of Got Ginch and Need Knickers. Need Knickers is a little bit newer than Got Ginch, but this is the last year. So because it's the last year, we want to make sure as many people as possible get out and just thank Brent King for his contribution to the life of our clients over the last 7 years. So here in Calgary, I think Brent's going to be here, but it's also Got Ginch Day in Edmonton as well. So please remember that. Flu shots, October the 29th. For both staff and guests. So you want to plan both here and at the shelter. So remember that. And the only other announcement is Halloween evening, we have our gala event. And the reason why I tell you is that this is our biggest fundraiser of the year. Last year, our net was just a little under $500,000. So it's a big deal for us, and so I'd like you to be praying about that as we move forward. Next week's speaker is Dean Kruvoit. Dean is our new managing director in Edmonton, and so we're going to turn it around next week. So instead of it all coming from Calgary to points unknown, it's going from Edmonton down to here and to the shelter. So Dean will be speaking from Edmonton next Wednesday. Good opportunity for those of you, especially here in Calgary, who haven't met Dean, to get to know him a little bit better. So Dean will be speaking next week. I'm going to turn the mic back over to Wendy. Wendy, it's so good to have you here. Wendy is one of our very special friends, and we really appreciate her. And come and share with us whatever it is you're going to share.
All right, fabulous. For those of you who have just come in, we've been working on generational challenges in the workplace, and I'm going to snitch back the piece. And okay, he's going to get it up for me. So we'll give you the Coles Notes version. We've been talking about team.